Today is the first Sunday of Advent, the 4 Sundays before Christmas. Time to think about Jesus coming. And what we heard for our gospel reading this morning is what's called the Annunciation. And that is when the angel Gabriel came to Mary and announced to her that she would be having the baby Jesus. And so that actually was done 9 months before the celebration of Christmas. The Annunciation is actually celebrated on March the 25th. And then 9 months from there is December 25th, which is Christmas. But I use that today because it fits in. People sometimes wonder whether or not Jesus was actually born on December the 25th. And there's always been a lot of interest in how that date was chosen. Now, a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, they just arbitrarily put that on the date back when they were celebrating the winter solstice. So Christians could just take that over. And that's what a lot of people will tell you, that they just arbitrarily chose the winter solstice time to celebrate Christmas. Well, the winter solstice is the shortest day of the year in terms of hour of daylight. You know, as we move through summer and fall, the days keep getting shorter. The sun rises later and sets earlier. And after December 21st, though, that starts reversing. The sun rises earlier and sets later. And so December the 21st has the least hours of daylight. That's what's called the winter solstice. And some societies celebrate that because they look at it as the point where you get the promise of spring, the rebirth. And sometimes it's said of Christianity that we just arbitrarily chose that as Christmas. But actually the choice of December the 25th had nothing to do with winter solstice. It was actually a byproduct of attempts among ancient Christians to find the date of Jesus' death. Now, you can say, and some scholars say, that this idea that Christmas came from winter solstice came from 2 people during the early Reformation time. One was a man named Paul Jablonski. He was a German Protestant. And back during the first years of the Protestant Reformation especially, the Protestants were full of criticism of anything Roman Catholic. And they tried any way they could to discredit anything from the Catholic Church. And so Jablonski set out on a mission. He wanted to show that the celebration, the many celebrations that they had in the Roman Catholic Church were things that the Catholics had taken from pagan society. And that was just pagan influences on Christianity. And he included Christmas in his list. Another man named Jean Hardoon, he was actually Roman Catholic, and he set out to show that the Catholic Church could adopt these pagan festivals without doing violence to the gospel. And so some scholars believe that these 2 men back long ago are where the idea came from that Christians hijacked the winter solstice festivals for their Christmas celebrations. Now the Romans created a calendar back in the year 45 BC that was called the Julian calendar. And that was the calendar still in use in many places during Jesus' time in the New Testament time. The winter solstice, according to that calendar, fell on December the 25th. And so it's tempting to say, well, Christians must just have chosen that because of that. But did they? Now we are told that the biggest festivals of the year for a pagan temple, that means when you celebrate something like the sun or something, is its temple dedication day. And we are told that there were 2 temples dedicated to the sun in Rome. One of which celebrated its dedication on August the 9th, the other on August 28th. In the 100s, though, when we have the first surviving hint that Christians were commemorating the birth of Jesus, activities around those two temples had declined, and we are told that the activities there were not very important to people, and people didn't pay them much attention. And in neither case does it appear that either one of these temples had any kind of winter solstice celebration. Now, moving on later, there was a Roman emperor named Aurelian who was emperor from 270 to 275, and he did not like Christianity. He promoted the establishment of what was called the celebration of the birth of the unconquered sun. That's sun, S-U-N. And he did that in an attempt to unify the various segments of Roman society around some kind of common celebration. And this was an attempt to unify an empire that he saw weakening. So he thought if we could get some kind of common thing here going every year all over the empire, that would help serve to strengthen the empire. That's the very same thing Constantine would think some 40 or 50 years later, when he wanted to make Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire in order to unify the empire. But anyway, Aurelian promoted this birth of the unconquered sun celebration of the winter solstice because he believed that that would be a good way to unify the Roman Empire. Now, if you remember back with the persecution of Christians that the Romans did, they did that as their empire began to weaken. And they saw the fact that it weakened as a sign that their gods were mad because they were tolerating Christianity. And so they persecuted Christians to try to get Christians to turn their backs on Christianity and pay homage to the Roman gods. The Romans thought their gods had established them as an empire, and when the empire started to crumble, they placed a lot of the blame for that on Christians, because Christians were not paying the Roman gods their proper homage. And so Aurelian began this festival, and he hoped, well, maybe it'll placate the gods. And this is the winter solstice festival that some claim was the forerunner of Christmas celebrations. And that began in the late 200s. Now, while the first actual evidence of formalized Christian celebrations concerning Christmas comes from about 60 years later from Rome, there is evidence that Christians attempted to figure out the dates associated with the life of Jesus much earlier. And they started with trying to determine the date of his death, because that was the most clear one. Now, there were no surviving accounts apparently in that time that gave the dates when Jesus was born, crucified, or anything else. And so people tried to work it out. There's one clue in the Gospels that might be helpful. Now, if you read the Gospels, you'll notice that there is a contradiction over the date on which Jesus was crucified. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all appear to place it on Passover Day. That is the day after the Passover meal is eaten at night. So these Gospels seem to indicate that Jesus ate a Passover meal with his disciples on the eve of his crucifixion. But the Gospel of John distinctly and quite forcefully places the crucifixion one day earlier, before the time of eating the Passover meal. So was the meal Jesus ate with his disciples the night before he was crucified a Passover meal or not? You see, that became crucial in the attempt to try to determine the date of the resurrection. And so they had to decide that. So the ancient Christians decided it was not. Remember, that was pre-1945, so you can say that back then. They decided to go with the Gospel of John reports and say it was not a Passover meal. Now, the reason that's important is because from the fact that all Gospels agreed that the day after the crucifixion was a Saturday, then that meant that the crucifixion had to have taken place on a Friday. And so with that in mind, they could look back 100 or so years earlier and see in what years around the time Jesus was supposed to have been crucified that the Passover meal would have been eaten on a Friday. So see, that you could go back to the approximate time period. But that presented another problem. People used all kinds of calendars back then, and they were not accurate. The calendars the Jews used were lunar calendars, and they had to be adjusted every so many years, and they were not exact. And plus, the Jews sometimes adjusted the dates of their Passover. So it seemed that it was an impossible task to try to go back and determine with any kind of certainty exactly the dates of the events of Jesus' life. But they came up with an approximation in their minds, not an approximation, but they came up with the date that they felt Jesus' crucifixion took place, and they decided to go with that. They came up with a date, and then Christians in the East and Christians in the West could not agree with how to go back there and work forward to get to today's day. So Christians in the East calculated it one way, Christians in the West calculated it another day, and the Eastern Christians decided Jesus was crucified on April the 6th. The Western Christians decided Jesus was crucified on March the 25th. So, there's two possible dates. Remember, it's the same day. They're just disagreement on how to calculate it forward into the future. So they thought that Jesus either died on March 25th or April the 6th. Now, how does that go back to the birth of it? Well, there was a belief that was popular in some forms of Judaism around the time of Jesus called integral age. And that simply means that the belief was that great Jewish prophets would either die on the day of their conception or the date of their birth. So now that they had figured out the date of Jesus' death, they could figure out the date of either his conception or his birth, because that would have been the same day he died on. So you have the idea that he would have either died on March the 25th, would have been born on March the 25th or December the 25th. And December the 25th won out. In other words, they decided that Jesus was born and then he died on the date of his conception, not his birth. So as I said, this date of conception, March 25th, became the Annunciation, and that's March 25th in the Christian calendar, and it's that way every year. March 25th, doesn't matter whether it's a Sunday or not. That's also the date on which the ancient Christians believed Jesus had died. He died on the date of his conception. Now, that's what it is in the West. In the East, it's April the 6th. If you've ever wondered why Orthodox Christianity celebrates Christmas on January the 6th rather than December 25th, that's why. Because the Orthodox do the conception on April the 6th and the birth on January the 6th. Western does the conception on March the 25th and the birth on December the 25th. That January 6th, though, did survive in Western Christianity, and it survived as what we call Epiphany, the day that the three magi went to Jesus and presented him gifts. And so Western Christianity adopted the April the 6th as the visit of the Magi. So, the date of celebrating Christmas on December the 25th came from an attempt to calculate the date of the death of Jesus. And they put that on March the 25th, and then that would mean Christmas is on December the 25th. Now, barring the discovery of some ancient manuscripts or something, we'll never know if that's true. It was an estimating process, to say the least, due to the way calendars were constructed back then and due to conflicting accounts from the Gospels. These dates are impossible to predict. And even if that, you could know the date of Jesus' death, it may or may not be true that Jewish prophets died on the date of either their death or conception, and I personally would not classify Jesus as a Jewish prophet. That's not how we look at Jesus, as a Jewish prophet. So the basis for having any date for the crucifixion or the birth is just something to have. If you're going to commemorate something, you've got to have some day to do it on. So we might as well do it on December the 25th, just keeping in mind that we're not actually saying that's when Jesus was actually born, only that's the day on which we traditionally celebrate it. Now, one reason I've spent so much time on this today, and I know this seems like a winding road to get here, is because it's popular today among people who want to denigrate Christianity to say that Christmas is nothing more than a Christianization of pagan festivals, and that Christianity has pagan origins. But it's not only non-Christians who say that. Many Christians say that too. I've had Christians come up and tell me that Christmas is just a hijacking of pagan celebration. They've been told that, they've read it somewhere, they've heard it somewhere, they've seen it somewhere. And maybe where they read it, or they saw it, or they heard it, came from Christian sources. And maybe it was very respected Christian sources, some prominent author, some prominent preacher, some prominent speaker. And sometimes people read and they hear stuff and they believe it without investigating it further and finding out whether it's true or not. It starts going around, and before you know it, it's gone around to the point where people just accept it and never question it. Just because it's something going around, and just because Dr. So-and-so on TV said it, or somebody wrote it in a book or something, does not mean it's right. And this applies especially to things from ancient Christianity. The historical record is so sparse that we know very little. And when we know very little, it's easy for people to put their own particular spin on something. Not because they're necessarily trying to mislead people, but just because it's so easy to jump to conclusions. I see that all the time in Christianity. And we jump to a conclusion because, well, hey, it must be so-and-so. And, oh, yes, it's so-and-so. And then, well, Dr. So-and-so said this, I read that. And then when we jump to conclusions and we start spreading it, people accept it as truth, and it gets going around. And before you know it, it gets accepted as something that's fact. And people believe it's true. The same thing happens with certain interpretations of the Bible. It's easy to take something from the Bible and jump to a certain conclusion, interpret it a certain way, and go with that, especially if it's promoted by some influential Christian figure. Then that becomes the correct interpretation. It becomes the one we're sure was always accepted, and it becomes the one we're sure actually the writer meant when they wrote it down. And then that gets passed down and passed around, and people believe it, and it's ironclad truth. It's never accepted. It's never questioned. I always caution people Now, this goes true for what I tell you as well as anybody else. Be very careful about what people tell you, about what you hear, and about what you read. You know, I don't disbelieve everything I hear or read about Christianity. I always approach everything, not with a skeptical mind, but with a mind that stands off a minute. And I say, now wait a minute. I certainly want to know the basis of something. And a lot of times when you start investigating to find the basis, you find there is no basis other than somebody's personal preference, somebody's assumption, or what somebody thinks it's got to be. And that's not the way to have Christianity. I always urge people, think, look behind it. When somebody tells you something, when you hear something, research it. Just because people say it does not mean it's true. And I have seen more people get in trouble in religion by that than with any other thing.